Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
Normally, we think of the justice system in terms of a television show like Law and Order, with assistant district attorneys working for the state to bring justice to the victims of crime. But in the real world, it can be something quite different. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The death of Michael Brown at the hands of a Ferguson police officer revealed a community in which the department and the city profited by citing mainly African Americans for traffic and other violations of the law. And apparently, this was not an isolated case. Daniel Hatcher has written a new book entitled Injustice, Inc., How America's Justice System Commodifies Children and the Poor. And we have him on the phone this afternoon. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on the show.
So you talk a lot about this, particularly at the end of the book, about racial and economic inequalities are inextricably intertwined in the profiteering used by each of the foundational institutions of justice. And one of the things you write about, and I wanted you to describe this, towards the end of the book, you open a chapter with a description of the segregated facilities for juvenile offenders in Memphis in the early part of the last century, and then revisit that situation in 1994. Give me a description of what that was like and what you think that means in terms of how we treat people, particularly people of color, in this justice system.
Right. It's a great question, and it's an unfortunate question to have to ask it. You know, we're still seeing the vast disproportionate harm and unequal treatment continuing today, and as not just causing harm to the impacted individuals, but commodifying those individuals. So as I discuss in the book, the example out of this particular juvenile court in Tennessee, you know, you look back to the court's foundings in the early 1900s, and at that time, unfortunately, across the country, you know, there was such disproportionate, unequal treatment based on race and the harm that came along with that. That same court, as you move forward through time, you did not see improvement in that disproportionate treatment. In fact, in some instances, the numbers, the data showed that the disproportionate treatment actually worsened.
You write about the monetizing of youth of color for maximum revenue, that there's this incentive, and I was particularly struck by the fact that there are these federal funds and programs out there that are certainly not intended for this kind of abuse that you then talk about in terms of this effect of trying to maximize the amount of money that they can get from the feds.
Right, and there are many ways. So in the book, I uncover all these contractual mechanisms in which each of our institutions of justice, our juvenile courts, our family courts, criminal courts, prosecutors' offices, probation departments, policing agencies, detention facilities, are all contractually monetizing the individuals they're supposed to serve. Right, our juvenile courts in particular, you know, they exist to provide justice and to serve the interests, the needs of vulnerable youth, right? They're supposed to provide justice for youth, not use them to maximize money. But in some states, our juvenile courts are actually generating revenue by removing children from their homes. Literally, the more children removed from their homes, the more revenue the courts generate. And it's just one contractual mechanism after another. There are examples in Maryland that are just stark in terms of the harm that's being inflicted upon low-income communities from these contracts with the 4D child support system, right, in which child support, instead of being used to benefit children, is being used to generate revenue from low-income families and causing harm in the process. Our courts in Maryland are generating millions by contracting with the child support agency. The child support agency is actually hiring the courts, right, paying the salaries of judicial magistrates, right, and more, through which they appear before. And the more they process these cases, the more money they make.
One of the histories that I was interested in was this idea of assisting the poor with the AFDC program, which was aid to families with dependent children. And then, of course, that's been converted into temporary assistance for needy families. I remember particularly in the 1980s, in the Reagan era, and how it really had an impact on the African-American community just at a time when we were trying to figure out a way for instance, single mothers particularly, that they could get along and at least survive and maybe even succeed in life. And yet there was this penalizing effect when all these things were put together.
Right. I mean, the history is harsh and has caused harm. And what I'm covering the book is much of that harm is continuing today, and now being actively monetized, right? So early on with what we considered our welfare programs, it wasn't until the mid '60s, right, in the civil rights movement, that most black families were even allowed to access these forms of aid programs. And it wasn't until the success of the civil rights movement and increasing access to crucially needed public aid that there grew this public backlash, right, and demonization of low-income mothers who received welfare, and the racism that came along with it in terms of the treatment of the individuals and the false narrative around welfare aid. That continued and grew into the beginnings of our 4D child support program, right? Most of the public have no idea that so much of what we call child support grew from a program that was really not about supporting children, right, but was about punishing low-income parents, right, and actually pursuing money that was called child support to repay, right, or to post bonds, right, against the risk of low-income children. So it wasn't about helping children, it was about generating revenue, and that is still continuing today. So in these contracts, in which the courts enter to generate revenue from these 4D child support programs, there are incentives built into the structure where they can generate even more revenue if they're pursuing low-income families in which the child support is owed to the government, right, rather than owed to the children. So the harm is immeasurable in Maryland and across the country.
Because one of the things that struck me and always surprised me is a bit that if you're incarcerated in a jail or whatever, you could still wind up accumulating all of this debt, even though obviously you can't make a living, and in some cases, obviously, they're charging you for the things that they're providing you in prison.
That's right. Unfortunately, child support often accrues while individuals may be temporarily incarcerated, right? And then if you come out, not only are you facing this huge arrearages that you don't have the ability to pay, often again owed to the government rather than even to the children, right? Your license is suspended, so you can't drive. If you need to drive to help your children, if you're going to risk it, some people do. You're going to do whatever you can to help your kids. You're pulled over and you're charged with another criminal offense of driving and a suspended license. If you're lucky enough to find work, then your income will be immediately garnished at 65%, right? So the math doesn't add up. You can't afford to work. You can't afford to make your payments, right? And it's cyclical harm, and that's just one piece, right? And then meanwhile, the courts, the prosecutors, probation are all pursuing endless fines and fees, as you mentioned with the example at the beginning, such as out of Ferguson, what happened there. That's happening across the country. Some probation departments require payment of fines and fees, thousands of dollars that have accumulated against low-income individuals and families as a condition of probation, right? So the individuals can never break out of probation, right, because they're unable to pay those growing fees, which probation keeps adding to, through the process. It's issue after issue after issue, and it's unmanageable, and it's low-income individuals don't have a chance to break out when the systems that are supposed to serve them with justice are instead using them for revenue.
Let me ask you this: even if we trim back a lot of the abuses that you've outlined, there does seem to be this connection between fines and fees and so on as punishment in relationship to funding, say, particularly local governments. They are going to generate money, that is, these fines, and the question becomes, what do you do with them? And in this particular case, and you point this out, that they often automatically go back to the people who are enforcing the law in the first place, which then gives them more incentive to then stop more people and just sort of this vicious cycle. Is there a way to break that?
Well, multiple ways, right? Our justice officials, our justice institutions are constitutionally required to be impartial. But that requirement is being violated across the country. When you're incentivized by the pursuit of revenue, whether through these fines and fees or pursuing foster care revenue or 4D child support revenue, right, the list goes on. There's multiple different ways they're incentivized to pursue revenue through the low-income individuals, right? That's a violation of impartiality. So the structures need to be changed where that incentive simply isn't built in, right? There needs to be neutral financing of our institutions of justice, right? Not this sort of commodification goal that we see. And Alabama, I write in the book as one of the examples, the district attorney's offices in Alabama, several of the district attorney offices receive 70% of their entire budget through the pursuit of these fines and fees, right? And it's incentivized. The more they pursue, the more they prosecute, the more money that they make. And then they share their collections with the courts. So the courts are then incentivized to order more fines and fees. There's a justice court is what it's called. I write about in the book out of Oregon. And then 1 year in the court's budget report, it's actually generated almost twice as much revenue as the court's total operating expenditures, right? So it's more of a profit court than a justice court.
So how do we then separate that out? And I guess in the sense that we are going to accumulate a bunch of money because we have these fines, the money that comes from those kinds of fines and so on, how should we handle them so that they don't get dumped back into this system that you described? I mean, what do we do with the money that we're getting, as it were, I guess? I mean, is there a way to...
Well, I mean...
Yeah.
It's a good question, and there are hopeful reforms in some jurisdictions in the country, whether at the juvenile court level or also in the system serving adults, to look more closely at the fines and fees system and try to reform and reducing the times in which they're even ordered in the first place, right? Some of these fines and fees are punitive from the outset, right, and inflicting harm when the systems are supposed to be providing justice, right? So you need to look at that initial structure. Some jurisdictions are wisely revisiting the question and reducing or sometimes eliminating juvenile fines and fees, right? But that hasn't happened nearly enough. But what you asked, even when there is some money then generated, right, it can't go to the judicial official who is ordering, right, the fine and fee. That creates that incentive. And it's really concerning when that happens. You know, I can envision other types of funds that it could be used to benefit, the community rather than serving as a slush fund, right, for the justice institutions. You're seeing them; they're increasingly using children and the poor as a commodity. You know, sort of like you can envision them almost on a conveyor belt, and they're mining them for every resource they can get. It's like a factory assembly line, but sort of in the reverse, right? You know, more of a disassembly line, and they're already struggling children and individuals are targeted, deconstructed for every possible penny.
We've been speaking with Daniel Hatcher. He's written a new book entitled Injustice, Inc., How America's Justice System Commodifies Children and the Poor. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
You're listening to Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. New artifacts have been found at the home of an enslaver on the farm believed to be the birthplace of Harriet Tubman. Efforts are underway to unionize a local Starbucks in Salisbury, while a new survey is out on the expectations for the local economy. And finally, we will explore profit and the justice system with a special look at their impact on the African-American community. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Greg Bassett is the editor and general manager of the Salisbury Independent. He joins us this afternoon. Welcome to the program.
Hey, Don.
So, Greg, I understand that Governor Wes Moore made a visit to Dorchester County this week, examining new artifacts that appear to be from the enslaver's home on the farm where Harriet Tubman once lived.
Yeah, it was a very interesting visit. The Tubman Museum there in Golden Hill and the excavation site, it's really worth visiting. If you haven't been over there, it's really worth going to see. It's a very moving experience. But the governor was in town for that. What was interesting was that the archaeologists determined that was the site of a home of an enslaved overseer. So it was a large home that they were able to excavate with a huge fireplace area, but you could also see that whoever lived there subsided on the most minor type food, was not served a very good diet at all, oysters and clams and fish. They found what is really interesting, what they described as a West African spirit cache, of very small items that was kept near the fireplace to keep away bad spirits. And it's just a fascinating discovery. Governor was there, a lot of attendance to that thing, and it was just great to see him in town to make a Black History event, kind of on the fly, there in Dorchester County.
Because that's one of the things that there was a question about, just how often the governor would be coming to the Eastern Shore.
Yeah, I get the sense, if you listen to some of Jake Day's social media stuff, I get the feeling that the governor's going to be in Salisbury a lot. So we'll see. I mean, Hogan had a vacation home in Ocean City, so he was constantly coming by on his way through. We'll have to see what Moore does. But certainly this was an inspirational event, and a lot of people were very moved by his attendance here on Tuesday.
Now, I also understand that the efforts, at least by the Wacomico County Executive, to revamp the liquor license operations here in the county apparently are at a dead end in Annapolis. What happened?
Yeah, so they never really were able to get the bills together, get agreement from the council on what direction they wanted to go. A last-minute deal to try to allow retailers and restaurant owners to buy from the open market instead of from the dispensary fell apart. There were just too many legal questions. The deadline for submitting bills was February 6th in the Senate, and then there was a later deadline in the House. That was last Friday. That came and went. So what they're going to do now is study it some more, try to get their ducks in a row for next year. No one is saying officially that it's dead, but there are no bills filed right now in the General Assembly to look at this. It's not on the lawmakers' radar screens at all. The dispensary has taken a pretty obstinate view on their role. They don't want that to change at all. And they've been very aggressive in their defense of what they have. The restaurant owners and retailers are upset with that. So it's a political issue. We'll see whether they move more toward free enterprise and what they're able to discuss. All the parties coming together at a table with Chamber of Commerce involvement to see what they're able to agree to for next year.
So I understand that the university has now decided to move the Ward Museum. Tell me a little bit about the decision, what you know so far.
Yeah, the university owns that building, and they've owned it since it was first constructed in the early 1990s. And, of course, last year they developed a mold problem with some leakage in a portion of the building that affected some of the exhibits. So the building was closed for a long time it's been closed since July, while they were examining the damage to the collection and trying to figure out how they were going to solve that problem. There's different accounts on how much it's going to cost to fix the damage and replace the HVAC. But in the meantime, the museum was closed. There was a lot of concern, and I think the university used this as an opportunity or a chance to maybe take that building in a different direction. So the collection, they assure us, is safe, in good hands right now, and it's going to be moved to some location in downtown Salisbury. Now, the university owns the building there, the downtown SU building, which is the old Woolworths building downtown. There's also a rumor that the Powell building next door, which is an apartment house type building, luxury condo type apartments, they have retail space on the first floor. That might be a site for the exhibits to go. So the exhibit is valued at about $9 million. So it's a very worthy collection. It needs to be preserved. It's a big part of our local heritage and all that stuff. It's always been a tourist attraction, but they're definitely not going to be anymore in that Ward Museum building. What the university is going to do with the building, they haven't told us. There's lots of rumors about what they're going to do with it. Like I said, there's lots of dispute about how much it's going to cost to repair it. And it's just it's been a blow to the carvers and the people in that community who loved having that great exhibit hall there on Shoemaker Pond, and they feel like they've sort of been cast out. But early on in this process, they also seemed to recognize that it was a done deal. There was nothing they could do to fight it, lacking the money and the ability to stand up to the university. They're going to have to go in a different direction.
Now, I also understand we've had a couple of incidents in the Wacomico County schools. I know that a 12-year-old girl apparently has been arrested over a bomb threat to Wacomico Middle School. What's going on with that? This is fairly unusual.
It is. It's like a trend for this year. So each of the high schools and now one of the middle schools has been hit with these bomb notes. So kids are leaving notes that are not very specific about what they're going to do in terms of if there's a bomb or whatever. Don't know if they want to disrupt class or what exactly is going on, but it is disrupting the schools. And in all these cases so far, and I think we're up to 6 now, the the school system and the sheriff's office is able to determine who the kids are. We can't name them because they are juveniles. We're not told who they are. But they have taken pretty severe action against these kids, and it's just not funny. It's not a game. It disrupts the schools. It disrupts the law enforcement officers. It just causes trouble. It brings fear. There's just very little patience, no patience for this kind of activity in the schools. And why it's being done, I can't really tell you.
Well, maybe on a bit of a lighter note, Dan Cox, who's the Republican nominee for governor last year, apparently he's moving on.
Yeah, he has been named chief of staff to Doug Mastriano, who is still in the state Senate in Pennsylvania, who ran against Josh, and I can't remember Josh's name, Josh Cohen maybe, who was elected
Josh Shapiro?
governor of Pennsylvania. Yeah, Josh Shapiro, I'm sorry, who was elected governor of Pennsylvania. But the latest thing with Dan Cox, and the reason it's news of Wycomico, is on Tuesday, Julie Giordano, our new county executive, has submitted his law firm to be the county's representative on high-profile cases that required expertise beyond what the current county attorney can provide, and that's Paul Wilbur. So previously, we had this guy Kevin Karpinski, who was the representative on HR issues. He negotiated the work contracts with the sheriff's office. He defended the county in a recent lawsuit involving some deputies who wanted some medical payments. He's been the high-profile human resources sort of lawyer for the county. Going back to Bob Culver, Bob Culver first hired Kevin Karpinski through his work with this group called Legit, which is a sort of a cooperative of law firms that do municipal government work. Julie Giordano has put forth not a proclamation, but a resolution to hire Dan Cox as the attorney for this. She has fired Karpinski's firm and has put forward Dan Cox's name. The question is he really qualified for this? He's mostly been a plaintiff lawyer. He is chief of staff to a public official down in Pennsylvania. He has a law firm in Frederick called the Cox Legal Center, but he doesn't even have a website, so I can't find out exactly how many people he is in that office. And according to the briefing book from the county, he's going to be paid a maximum of $350 per hour for any work he does for the county, and he's going to receive a $5,000 retainer. Now, you would compare that to Paul Wilbur, the current county attorney, who operates with no retainer and is paid $180 an hour. Just what the reason for this is unknown. I did some research. It doesn't appear that Mr. Cox donated to Giordano's campaign. They certainly campaigned together when he was running for governor. They are friends. It's obvious. You look at social media, they seem friendly. They were at events together. She attended a fundraiser for him that was held at President Trump's estate down in Palm Beach, which she got a lot of flack for and a lot of publicity for. But still, this is a very strange arrangement that Dan Cox might be part of, the Wycomico County payroll as a lawyer doing special projects that are beyond the scope of our normal lawyers.
We've been speaking with Greg Bassett. He's the editor and general manager of the Salisbury Independent. Appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
Thanks for having us, Don.
You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.